Okay, so in the last few videos, we've been looking at how we can bring data into Alteryx that resides in a file of some kind, specifically taking a closer look at the more common file types such as Excel and CSV files. In this video, we'll now turn our attention to connecting to data that resides in a database. Now, I'm aware that some of you may be extremely proficient in SQL and know how to query data from a database, whereas others may have never touched a line of SQL code ever. Now, don't worry, I will try to keep things as simple as possible, but if you're interested in getting set up with a database on your own machine and you want to learn how to query databases using SQL, then feel free to take a look at my SQL Bootcamp course that contains over 11 hours of tutorials to bring you fully up to speed. When you can query data from databases effectively using SQL and also understand how to create workflows using platforms like Alteryx, you can produce some fantastic output that is automated and requires little manual effort, if any. The main thing to get out of this video though is the fact that there are loads more data connectors in Alteryx that you can use. This means that wherever your data sits, you're able to bring them into one workflow and make them speak to each other, even if they're across different formats. This is one of the biggest advantages of using a tool like Alteryx, as those once upon a time disparate data sources can now be joined together. So in the same fashion as connecting to a file, we need to drag and drop an input data tool onto the canvas. Now in the configuration window, you would have already seen that we can connect to a file or database. So let's drop down the option menu and take a look at the database options. In the Files tab, we had a long list of files we can input. But if we select on the Data Sources tab underneath, you can see we get a choice of many databases that we can connect to. So in addition to the frequently used Microsoft SQL Server and Oracle databases, we can connect to MySQL, Impala, Amazon S3, Snowflake, Google BigQuery, Hive, MongoDB, and many more. In this example, I will connect to the same database I used in my SQL course, which is a MySQL database. So I'll come up to where it says MySQL and then select ODBC, which stands for Open Database Connectivity and will enable us to connect to our database. This will bring up a window where it then asks for the MySQL data source name, which you can see is defaulting to the Secure schema within the database as I'd previously set this up. But in order to set up a connection, you would need to select on ODBC admin and then add a data source, which I'm doing through the user DSN. You will simply need to provide some connection details such as the server name, port, and schema to successfully connect, which I'll not be going through in this video. Once the connection has been set up, you can then enter your username and password for your database and then click OK. Now if you're joining to another database, for example an Oracle database, you will have a slightly different configuration window, but it will be asking for similar things, such as an account you want to use that has privileges to the database. When we click OK, we are presented with a window where we can do a few things. We can choose a table that we want to join to that resides in the Secure schema by clicking on the Tables tab, which will just list a set of tables. We can also use the Visual Query Builder where we can establish joins across multiple tables and add further logic if required. The Stored Procedures tab is not something that is supported by this connection. And finally, and in my opinion the best option, is to use the SQL Editor tab. The SQL Editor tab allows us to type in SQL queries that will then be executed to pull back data from the database into Alteryx. Now once again, you will need to have a basic understanding of SQL in order to write simple SQL queries, but hopefully what I'm about to show you is not too difficult to follow. So let's now briefly go across to our database and take a look at some of the data we have in it. On the left hand side within the Schemas section, you can see we have the Secure schema, which is what we are joining to. If I expand Tables, you can see the list of tables. If I expand the Customer table and then expand the Columns section, we can see a list of columns that exist within the table. If I scroll down the tables a bit, you can see we have another table called Payment, which stores payment information related to each customer for the films they've been renting. Now what we will do is write a short query in the database to pull back the data that we want to see, and then we'll copy this query over to our SQL editor in Alteryx. So for our query, what we'll look to obtain is a list of payments that each customer has made. So we'll need to join the Customer table with the Payment table. Now don't worry if this is alien to you, just try to follow the concept. So I'll start by typing select star, which means select all columns, from the customer table. And we will alias the customer table to be called C in the rest of the query, so we don't have to type it out every time. Next, we will join to the payment table and alias the payment table as P. We then have to stipulate what field we want to join the tables on, which is the customer ID field, as this is the primary key of the customer table and the foreign key that resides in the payment table. Now, rather than bringing back all fields from both tables, I will actually change this to be all columns from the customer table, and then I will only bring back the rental ID column and the amount column from the joined dataset. When we run this query, you can see that we get a result set below which gives us all the payments that each customer has made. So we can see that Mary Smith has been renting quite a few films, as well as Patricia Johnson. Now I'm happy with this table, and it's the exact dataset that I want to bring into Alteryx. So what I'm now going to do is copy and paste the query from the database UI into Alteryx. Now I'll just tidy the columns up so it's neater to read. And there you have it. We now have an SQL query in Alteryx which will now read from the MySQL database. And seeing as we've tested the query to see what result it brings back, we know we're going to get the dataset that we want. Now if we click on Test Query, we can see that a successful connection was made, so we're not expecting any errors when we click OK. Okay, so now we've made our connection. Before we observe the results, let's take a quick look into the configuration pane to see what other options are available. Now in the table or query option is where we can come to edit our query if we want to. If I scroll down, we have some other options which, for example, allow us to execute an SQL query before our query is run, or execute a query after our query is run. Now why would we want to do that? Well, executing a query before this query is run could be useful if we wanted to delete some data from a database before our query is executed, to ensure that the result is what we want. Now I predominantly use this when I'm loading data back to the database, to ensure we're not duplicating data that resides in the table, but we'll cover this in more detail in the Output to Database video. Okay, so the final thing we need to do is add a browse tool after our input data tool so that we can see the results. And then we can run the workflow. When we do this, our workflow takes 1 second to run, and you can now see the same dataset in Alteryx within the results window. This data is now ready to be fed into subsequent tools for data preparation, transformation, reporting, and so on. Now if I click on the canvas to see the messages, you can see that Alteryx has read in 16,049 records in 1 second. If the database had stored over 1 million records, then Alteryx would bring in the full dataset, which is why it can be so powerful for data transformation as opposed to using the traditional spreadsheet tools such as Excel. Okay, great. So in summary, we have connected to a database, in this example a MySQL database, but we can connect to a whole lot more. We have written a query in the database to get a result we want, and then we copied the query into Alteryx. Now we could have written the query directly in Alteryx, but it's good practice to get a clean dataset as per expectation using the database, as it has much better debugging output if your query is ever wrong. We then simply hit run, which sources the data ready to use in subsequent tools for whatever your use case is. A very neat way of handling large datasets. If you've not covered SQL or databases in a lot of detail, I hope to see you inside my SQL Bootcamp course.